Yes. Sign out. Sorry.
All right, I'm going to project, but if anybody's having a hard time hearing, let me know, and I will put on a microphone and we'll get that going. But is that loud enough for everybody?
No.
No?
Yeah.
I find the microphone easier.
There you go.
Exactly. Same is part of my.
We usually don't have one on my face. So that seems really loud. Is that really loud for you guys?
I'll turn it down a little bit.
Perfect. Okay, I'll be loud then. Yeah, so my name's Ben Olson. I'm the Comal County and Kendall County wildlife biologist for Texas Parks and Wildlife. I've been here for about 2.5 years now. And I come from kind of all over the place. Originally from nearby Kansas City, Missouri. And I got my bachelor's degree in wildlife conservation and management in Northwest Missouri. And then worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service for a little while. Knew I didn't really know very much. It's kind of this fun thing with, as most of you are aware, the more you learn, the less you know you learn. And so I went to graduate school at Texas A&M Kingsville, did a bunch of work there, researching northern bobwhites, doing some fun stuff in the summer heat with them. And then graduated with my master's in wildlife management, and then bumped up to about the complete opposite of South Texas and north of Green Bay, Wisconsin, where we switched the extreme heat to the extreme cold. So I always say I can rightfully complain about whatever the weather is, whether it's 120 or negative 45. It's all terrible, and we all deal with it. So, and then that led to me coming back here and being the wildlife biologist for these wonderful counties here in the Hill Country. So. Today we're going to talk about pollinators. I think it's a topic you guys are all going to be very interested in, especially with the work that all of you guys do and all that. So, so we'll dive right into that. And then, when we come to a talk like this, a lot of us are kind of wondering, at least a lot of questions I get, how do I get a lot of butterflies in my yard, right? That's usually something a lot of folks want. There's usually several things. One of them, you could be really nervous about meeting somebody, or maybe somebody you like, so that might be a reason to get butterflies. Maybe you're nervous about giving a public speech, right? So that happens. But really the best way to get butterflies is to have native wildflowers throughout the whole growing season. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that today, or tonight. I guess it's kind of in between this evening. So we're going to take a 64,000 foot view from the top. What is pollination? Why does it matter? And then look into who are our native pollinators here in the Texas Hill Country or Texas in general. Why does that matter that I'm specifying native pollinators? And then, what are some challenges a lot of these animals and organisms are facing, as well as, what can we do to support them, whether we have our own property where we have a small garden or a small yard, or even those places with large acreages of ranches. So that's what we'll talk about, and we'll kind of go from there. So what is pollination, right? And at the heart of what pollination is, all it is the reproduction of plants, right? We'll go back to our high school science class and talk about parts of a flower. There's the male part of the flower, the stamen, that produces the pollen. Pollen's got to get to the female part of the flower, the pistil. And so something has to move the pollen from the anther to the stigma in order to fertilize the flower, to produce the seeds, which produces the nuts and the fruits, and all these vital things are essential to our survival as well as every other animal on Earth. So, there's different strategies. Mother Nature has a wonderful way of proving every single rule wrong in some case. So we're just dealing in general, the general sense of talking about the typical flowering plant. And that's going to be, roughly 75 to 95% of those absolutely need some sort of organism to physically conduct that pollination. And so they are heavily relying on these pollinators in order to continue to live throughout the world and also produce a lot of the things that we need for our survival. And so, here's kind of a graph of showing, kind of the process. When we think of pollinators, one of the first things we all think of is bees, right? And so, bees are going and collecting nectar for a food source, whether it's for themselves or for a hive. They're collecting the pollen on themselves as they're doing this. They're traveling to the next flower down. If it's the same species, some of that pollen will rub off on the next plant, and then you'll end up with a plant being fertilized, and you're moving that pollen from tree to tree. And it also ends up everywhere. Like, sometimes we end up with a lot of pollen on our cars. That's an example of like windblown pollen and things like that. Different strategies that things have. And so, this relatively simple act has a massive impact on the entire, global scale. We call this an ecosystem service, something where some sort of organism provides some service that greatly impacts the ecosystem. So pollinators are doing probably one of the most significant ecosystem services on Earth, and that's, providing this pollination service to over 180,000 plant species globally. That's also including 1,400 agricultural crops that are essential for our survival, for livestock survival, everything else out there. This kind of roughly equates to 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we have is directly responsible from pollination. So, and then even breaking that down a little bit more, even half of the world's diets of fats and oils comes directly from these animal pollinated plants. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about that in a minute. So what does that mean in terms of dollars, right? It's trillions and trillions of dollars globally that are impacted based on this practice. 75% of major agricultural crops require pollination. In the U.S., it's a multi-billion-dollar industry related directly to these bees, these wasps, these moths, whatever we're specifically talking about, directly causing this pollination so that we can grow crops. So kind of getting back to the fun part, at least I'm a wildlife biologist, so I like talking about animals and things like that. So the fun part being, what are the insects, or what are the pollinators? So we've got insects, right? That's one that we think about all the time. We've got our hummingbirds or bird species. One that's always kind of left behind that is just as important is mammalian pollinators. All of these play a vital role within the ecosystem. Let's talk about insects for a minute, starting with them. It's the most diverse, largest group of animals on Earth. It's mind-boggling just how many insects there are in the world. Over 800,000 species have been identified, with more every day being identified further. In terms of numbers, they outnumber us humans over 1 million to 1, which is just mind-boggling to think about. That's how many we've got rolling around on Earth. So, this bottom section, I've got some percentages that represents the percentage of species globally on Earth. So insects account for 59% of Earth's species. Other animals would include like us or birds, amphibians, things like that. There's only 13%, and then plants make up 21%, which is a pretty good chunk of that pie that we're going. So insects are incredibly important. Anything from butterflies to moths to bees to wasps are all providing these important services, and they're all going to provide unique services. Different native pollinators are going to pollinate different species of plants, and they're going to have their own niche that they live in and they work in. It's a great testament to the biodiversity we have. Okay. So native versus non-native bees. This group probably, there might be quite a few of you that know that the honeybee is not a native species to North America. It's a European form. So why does that matter? There's 3,500 native bee species in North America, 700 of them roughly, it's kind of hard to count, 700 of them in the state of Texas. Roughly 30 non-native bees. The one that's most well known, like I said, is the honeybee, which came over from Europe in roughly the 1600s. It's a species that we widely consider as a naturalized species, so it's an introduced species that's been around a long time. It's filled, it has been able to fill some sort of role in the new area that it's a part of, but it still doesn't fit the natural native, same role that a native species would. Honeybees are excellent for pollinating agricultural crops. They're not as good with our native plants, which is an important part of this discussion, especially with these native pollinators, especially as we go further on when we're talking about challenges. Our native pollinators are, like I said, excellent at finding, whether it is antelope horn milkweeds or some of our clammy weeds or bee balm, things like that. They're going to be much more easily pollinated by some of these native bee species. Which also kind of like leads to, a lot of us think of bees as being, the beehive, the big group, the queen, the drones, the worker bees. We think of this social network that honeybees have, but in reality, over 90% of the bee species in Texas are solitary. They live on their own, they do their own thing, they build their own individual nest. You can kind of see in this lower picture, that's a solitary bee. Starting to build a nest into the stalk of a plant, which is where distinction is separated, right? Honeybees, bumblebees is another native social bee that we have that we're probably most familiar with as a native social bee that we see. So the solitary bees, they won't sting you usually, because it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense that if you're by yourself and you're trying to protect a nest, that you're not going to survive that, so your nest is going to fail. Whereas with these social bees, they've got a big hive with a lot of different individuals in it. It's a lot easier for somebody for that nest to be protected because you've got numbers, even if you do lose individuals in that attack or defense. So social bees typically, solitary bees typically don't get into any stinging of people, so they kind of live on their own. A lot of them are ground nesters, so they'll burrow into the ground or burrow into trees. I'm sure many of you have seen the holes in bees like mason or carpenter bees before. These are all examples of solitary bees that kind of do their own thing. They don't bother anything, but we don't see them as much, but they're out there pollinating away just as much as anything else, if not more. So, birds is hummingbirds. We're all pretty familiar with them. Don't forget about our orioles. They're going out pollinating. Again, the specific flowers have adapted to have different sizes and shapes, and so hummingbirds have adapted to have a longer snout, so they're able to reach down further deep into the flower in order to collect nectar, which is, again, strategies where plants and some bird has adapted for each other in order to work together in the long run. So essential part of pollination for a lot of species. Fun discussion on bats as pollinators. Bats are our main mammalian pollinator. We've got to mention that other species of mammals do pollinate too, whether it's badgers, mice, even humans. If you're walking through grass, during a season where there's a lot of pollen, there are cases where plants are being pollinated as you're walking through the grassland. So it does occur, but main thing I want to focus here is really on the bats and the important part. So for agricultural crops, bananas, guava, cashews, dates, figs, sugar, corn, cotton, and even agave are plants that rely on bats, especially agave. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But a lot of these bats are filling a nocturnal role. A lot of plants are only going to be blooming at night. One of those examples is going to be the agave plant, which which I'll talk about, which is a big topic right now is bats and tequila, right? Agave being the main ingredient for tequila relies completely on the Mexican and the lesser long-nosed bats because they're kind of in Mexico, southwestern part of Texas, parts of Arizona, New Mexico, where some of these agave plants grow. They'll shoot up the flowers to really, really tall shoots, and these bats will come in at night and feed on them as they're migrating through an area. They solely rely on these plants for food, their food source, because there's nothing else blooming. Maybe it's really dry. There's not a whole lot in terms of wildflower use there at night whenever these bats are flying through, and so they're relying totally on this as the food source. And so these plants have utilized these bats to reproduce and maintain longevity. Well, the tequila industry's boomed over the last few years or decades, and part of the process of making tequila results in a lot of the industry removing a lot of those plants before they're able to flower out. Now, and as that industry is booming, there's more space being created to grow, commercial agave plants, and so you're getting these larger spans of fields of agave where there's never going to be any flowers blooming from there because they're being dug up and utilized before them. There's some manufacturer companies that are starting to leave a few here and there, a certain percentage, so that some of these bats are able to get some of the nectar from flowers that are left over. Bat Conservation International is one of the big organizations that's doing a lot of research on this right now. They've got a bunch of really cool projects going on with them where they're working with some of the tequila manufacturers as well as local landowners in that area to plant wild agave plants, and the idea is that we're leaving a certain percentage so that enough these species, both of these species are on our species of greatest concern. I believe the Mexican long-nosed bat is endangered in both Mexico and the United States are classified. And the lesser, I believe, is either listed or in the process of getting there in both of those countries too. But so yeah, it's kind of there's an interesting dynamic going on there. It's fun to learn about. Like I said, Bat Conservation International, batcon.org is their website. They've got a lot of really good website on their information they've got growing for those projects. So if you guys are interested in learning more about that, you can do that there. So, we're talking about, these different types of pollinators. There's a lot of information going around. We're seeing a lot of discussion about these declines in populations of pollinators, kind of more specifically talking about our insect pollinators, right? There's quite a few projects that have gone on. One of the more prominent ones in the recent history is a study that was done in Germany in these protected areas that found a 75% loss in flying insect biomass over the last 30 years. It's a little concerning. That's a pretty substantial decline, or in anything. And that's a specific situation over in Germany. There's been some other projects done in other areas. Usually it's ranging from 25 to that 75% loss or decline, and most of those studies. And a good example is the monarch butterfly. That's the big item in the news these days. You got a pretty remarkable migration pattern where it takes several generations to go back to their wintering grounds in New Mexico. It's really fascinating to go, but in central Mexico where they do overwinter, they gather, and if any of you have seen pictures of these forests, of these trees where there's just these massive columns of monarch butterflies in the millions. And since the 1990s, those have been documented to decline by over 80% in a lot of small sections in areas. There's also another group that overwinters over along the coastline, western coastline of California, that's showing a pretty substantial decline as well. And so, there's all these studies that are being done. A lot of them are being done, still to this day. There's a lot of questions still figuring out things. So it's not necessarily a black or white issue. There's some species that are doing the same or are increasing. Sometimes it's not always a good situation, like an emerald ash borer is an invasive insect that up north, with the ash trees is totally decimating entire forests of ash. And so, it kind of depends on what species we're talking about, what are the circumstances. It's kind of the lovely thing about science and natural resource management is, the answer to everything is it depends, and that's always the only answer that matters. Depends on, I do that all the time with my day-to-day job. Well, technically it depends, but in this situation. It's a very complex issue, but there's a lot of other things that are being impacted, and a lot of the same stuff that's impacting, whether we're talking about pollinators, or maybe I'm talking about turkeys or deer or whatever the species is. A lot of these things, or several of these common causes of decline are going to be across the board. Loss of habitat. Are we dealing with any urbanization in Comal County? Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of habitat loss, there's a lot of fragmentation, there's a lot of loss of connectivity of habitat. Different species need connected wildlife corridors in order to be able to travel. That's no different for these pollinators, whether we're talking insects, whether we're talking birds or mammals, things like that. They need space, they need food, they need water, all these essential components of what we call habitat. And so, when we lose that, talking specifically about our pollinators, humans are really great at destroying grasslands through mowing and having monocultural lawns, right? We want the lawn to look nice, but it's essentially a desert, worse than a desert. A desert is actually pretty diverse. So, that to pesticide use, to competition with non-natives, whether we're talking non-native plants as competition or non-native animals. Non-native plants, talking about that for a little bit. Interesting tidbit of some studies that have found is it doesn't have to be necessarily like a plant from like Asia or Europe or somewhere like that for it to be an issue for a native pollinator. There's been some studies that have shown that even if you get a plant, say, just throwing an example out, say it's from the East Coast somewhere in the United States, and you move it over to Texas, put it out there, maybe we still have bumblebees in that area, right? It's the same pollinator species, but they do not recognize that plant as a plant that they can eat as a food source in this area. That's kind of been a more interesting, recent thing that we've learned is these localized populations of insects have adapted to these specific native plants, whether or not they could use them in other parts of the range. And so they won't use them, which means they won't get pollinated. And so competition with non-natives doesn't necessarily mean some radical plant from some other country. It could be something as simple as one individual here or there, even if it's within the same range of that pollinator. Different animals, obviously we deal a lot with that, whether it's from different non-native pollinators that are going in and competing for food resources, space, other issues. I guess we'll swing into this, might as well. What can you do to help with pollinators and things? Obvious is having a variety of pollinator-friendly wildflowers in their landscape, right? Really with most wildlife management issues, having an increase in diversity of native vegetation is almost always going to be one thing we can do to help, right? Different wildlife species, whether we're talking pollinators, whether we're talking deer or turkeys, whatever, is going to benefit from greater diversity of vegetation, whether that's through supplying food for pollination or nectar, or whether we need to have a nest for young insects, to providing shelter or space in order to actually create the nest. And so having a wide variety of flowers, and more so, we've got a pretty long growing season this year, and down in this part of the world. And so, there's different wildflowers, as you guys are very well aware, that grow throughout the season. So having a nice diverse mix of wildflowers in order to account for that, so that there's something blooming, several things blooming throughout the whole season. Part of what I do in my normal day-to-day work is work with private landowners to look at potential like grassland restoration stuff. Some projects we've done where we've removed like some of these invasive grasses that we deal with. KR bluestem is a big prominent one here in this area, where we've gotten rid of that. We've done our best to and go in and plant with a huge swath of native grasses and forbs. And the target is to increase with, say whether it's like 4 or 5 species that bloom early spring, midsummer, late fall, so that the idea is that there's several species blooming at every time, and that's trying to tackle this very issue of making sure there's something blooming for our bees or hummingbirds or whatever at the same time. In theory, we should not have to put out hummingbird feeders. They should be able to get that from the flowers that we get. We like seeing hummingbirds, and there's also, usually a lack of sufficient wildflowers out there. So that's why that's become a practice. So this kind of same thing, providing shelter. Again, one of the pillars of habitat for a species, whether we're talking deer or pollinators or insects, it's all the same practices. We need shelter. We need somewhere to have a nest, right? To cover from weather. Hopefully, we're getting some rain sometime tonight, right?
It's raining now.
It's raining now. Okay, cool. Awesome. I'll keep talking. If I keep talking, we'll hope it continues. We desperately need it, as you all know. So, so things like that. Even leaving grass thickets in areas of dense vegetation can provide that shelter. And so, if you've got brush piles or have the ability to leave some small brush piles for some dead trees, or this picture, I don't know how well some of you in the back can see it, but this is a partially mowed lawn where there's been like a square left in the middle to let grow up. I know in this part of the world, it's not always easy to be able to do that with HOA regulations and things like that, but it's a good thing to discuss at the meetings, right? The importance of leaving some of this grass to grow so that pollinators are able to get food, but they're also able to nest and also get some shelter. There's also, like I said, the brush piles do the same thing. These nest blocks for like your carpenter bees have been really popular over the last handful of years. I've seen them more and more. So those provide some really useful shelter. And again, really easy to do if you're on even your own small half-acre lot property, all the way up to I'm still talking to landowners with properties over 1,000 acres, where we're talking about these very same concepts. Different scales, different levels of practicality in what you do, but the size of your property does not matter when it comes to that. Avoiding use of pesticides, there's been a lot of research has shown that they're pretty detrimental to pollinator insect health, even some of our non-insect pollinators. There's been some issues with that, and even doesn't necessarily have to kill them. Sublethal doses have been shown to reduce ability to get out and collect food or pollinate or even reproduce. And it doesn't even have to be that they're sprayed with herbicide. It could just be residue on the vegetation afterwards. And so it can have unintended consequences. There's a variety of different recommended different alternative treatments for pesticides if you're dealing with some sort of issue or not. A lot of times it's coming up. There's no easy decision for things. You're going to have to. There's a little give and take that occurs, and that's with any wildlife, especially any sort of wildlife damage issue where it's armadillos is a big one where they're getting in the grubs. Well, you get rid of the grubs, you're going to get rid of the armadillos because they're trying to get food. But sometimes you need those grubs for plants or other reasons, or if you're raising chickens or something like that. So you're kind of dealing with a give and take Mother Nature, trying to figure that out. And then, you know, more importantly, really, is to talk about things with people, right? Education is the most important thing we can do over really any of the topics we're talking about in society, especially with our natural resource stuff, especially with needs of, um, of pollinators, and, you know, the declines they've had. So there's a lot of groups out there that do a lot of talks. My colleagues, myself, and a bunch of other folks that work with Texas Parks and Wildlife are giving talks kind of like this all the time. Doing things like that. The Texas Master Naturalists are out doing pollinator stuff all the time. We work with schools a lot of times with like to do the workshops. We've got some folks in the Hill Country District last week do a big workshop in Fredericksburg where they had all kinds of stations with the whole elementary school, and one of the stations was talking about pollinators, and they had kids running around with butterfly nets, and it was a good fun time. So, you know, other things, there's other groups that'll show people like to go out and for the Monarch Watch is a big organization that they'll tag monarchs and they're studying them, so that's, you know, a way people can get involved. Xerces.org is Xerces is the Society for Invertebrate Conservation. That there's like one, you know, if you're looking for a resource for just a wealth of information on pollinators, that is the one to go to. They've got anything and everything you can think of. We've got some stuff on Texas Parks and Wildlife's website. Got a picture of a publication that's pretty useful if you've got some property. I happen to have a copy of it with me on me, but it's management recommendations for these native insect pollinators and different things you can do, whether it's a grassland where sometimes I try to talk to folks about leaving like a third of the grassland not shredded or mowed or done anything with every year, and you rotate that around, and that applies to not just our pollinators, but a bunch of different wildlife species. We really like heterogeneity, big fancy word for, you know, a variety of structure in the vegetation. And then another big thing that's been growing the last few years is the Texas Pollinator Blitz through the iNaturalist. We've got a group with Parks and Wildlife called the Texas Nature Trackers that do a lot of really cool outreach stuff. And it's along with the Master Naturalists where they kind of drum up a lot of support throughout the state to get people to get out and like identify different pollinator species. And it's kind of a way to get a decent count of what we've got at the state. It's usually in October when it's out, usually around the mid-October. And so that's a lot of fun to do. And so some, you know, final thought through here, right, is just, you know, a variety of native plants and wildflowers, you know, having that diversity and structure. If you're able to leave some shelter in the area, it's going to be really the best thing you can do. It's relatively easy to do, and it has huge benefits. Plus, you get to see a lot of really neat stuff, whether it's these different butterflies that I've had or moths. In this presentation are these different bee species, most of which don't sting, which is a good thing, right? Right. So, you know, so we don't have to worry about that as much. And so, yeah, that's my contact information. If anybody's interested in or has a need to chit chat, most of what I do is a lot of private lands management. We've got a pretty robust technical guidance program for the entire state. Like I said, I cover both Comal and Kendall counties. We have other folks that cover, there's a biologist in every county. And so if some of you happen to be outside of these two counties, we can get you in contact with whoever you might be interested in. But yeah, we could obviously talk about this for like an entire college semester. But you know, Macy and Travis are the only two that are really excited about that. You know, at this time. But yeah.
Any
Questions? I know I talk fast. I really tried to tone that down over the years.
James?
What sort of things do you do when you go to somebody's ranch that say has 1,000 acres or something, and they've been maybe raising cattle, maybe something? What kind of things what kind of objectives do you have for them?
Yeah, so like, how do I approach a large scale project or property, right? How does that differ for pollinators versus a small scale? So a lot of it is, when we do like our technical guidance thing, the most important thing is learning what are the landowner's goals, right? Are they wanting to increase pollinator biodiversity? And, you know, quite frankly, I work with, you know, people all the time, and that's becoming a more, especially in this area, we've got all these newer landowners coming in, folks, usually, you know, we're getting a younger generation of owners going in. We're seeing a lot bigger interest in pollinators and things like that. So we're more and more frequently talking about that. And so, yeah, if they've got cattle, we can use cattle as a tool for pollinator management. We can use the shredder as a tool. And all that is looking at what does the property look like? How much cedar does it have? Usually we're going to talk about cutting cedar, juniper, that's hill country. That's what we're going to be doing. If we've got areas of grasslands, we're going to look at those and look at the diversity of plants that are in there. Do they need to do anything? Most of the time they do. So if they've got cattle, what does it look like? Do we need to adjust the number of cattle to allow part of that field to grow? Does it need to rest? It's going to depend, right? So, you know, we got that, or, you know, maybe we need to think about shredding it if we can. You know, parts of the hill country is too rocky, so that's another, you know, layer there that might change what we do. The single best thing we can do in this area for grasslands for pollinators is burning. Well, that adds a whole different level of complexity, right? Especially in Comal County with how many people, subdivisions and stuff like that. But there's a lot of landowners that do a lot of really neat prescribed burning. And we have a prescribed burn coordinator that works with folks, and we kind of get everybody set up to try to help them out with that. But so yeah, it just depends. It's just at a larger scale. So if we got 1,000 acres, maybe, you know, we're going to talk about what are the landowner's goals. You know, do they have a budget? Because obviously everything costs money, right? And so if we want to, you know, kind of manage what we're doing, you know, maybe we're looking at doing 20 acres a year or something like that. We're going to start looking at the long scale, you know, or maybe they're really ambitious and they want to knock off a couple hundred acres that first year or whatever. It's just going to depend on that. But it's essentially the same practices, just at a different scale. And, you know, which practice might be better is going to depend on that scale too. Prescribed burn on the larger acre property is going to be way more efficient in terms of cost, because you're going to have, you know, add a handful of people and maybe a couple of pieces of equipment. That's it. And you're going to still have to do that effort on a small scale too. It's just one example.
What do you mean by shredding?
Shredding is mowing with a mower tractor. Yeah. Like where I grew up, it was always mowing. Yeah, brush hog. Yeah. Yeah.
I was asking that for other people.
I usually try to say them both when I do it, because in my mind it's mowing. It's a lingo down
A
here.
couple people whisper in my ear.
Yeah. That's why the closet's half, you know, cracked.
Yeah. So how does burning help pollinators?
So how does burning help pollinators? So what it does, so with natural vegetation, we've got to have some sort of disturbance to rejuvenate the root system so it reestablishes and grows, right? That's why we do some of the shredding. It's all the same type of stuff. So when we're doing any kind of management, the idea is to apply some sort of disturbance that allows and stimulates that vegetation to regrow or allows different species to grow. So we have this concept, and I usually talk about this in my talks, but I didn't for this one for some reason, with ecological succession. So there's an order at which we see different plant species grow. A late stage here in Texas would be the cedar, where you have the cedar grow, it's really tall, grass you don't, or tree, you don't see anything growing underneath it, and it doesn't change, it'll stay in that. We call that a climax community. These pollinators are relying on these smaller wildflowers, or even some grasses. Those are what we're going to call more of a pioneer species. And so we're going to do a fire that'll kill and get rid of a lot of that cedar, a lot of that late stage. It'll get rid of a lot of the dead vegetation that is no longer being used, and that's going to regenerate a lot more vegetation growth. So there's going to be a lot more food availability. And that brings in, well, okay, well, you said you wanted shelter earlier. So that is why we only do a little bit at a time, so that we're having basically a mosaic on the landscape so that, yeah, there's some shelter over here, and we've got this patch over here that we're gonna burn, mow, shred, whatever, this year, so it'll grow, and then we'll shift that around. And so we've always, at any point in time, we're gonna have a grassland that's got everything in it, not just one monoculture of just old vegetation. So that's kind of the strategy, and it's gonna work for most wildlife species. We're gonna have that same type of discussion. Different species require different stages of succession. Some of them require multiple stages. So again, that's kind of where it leads to, like, the diversity of vegetation and structure is key to any of this stuff. Yeah.
More questions? Great.
Cool. Well, thank you all.
Go ahead and take like 10, 15-ish minutes and we'll get the meeting started.